So today, this map should be familiar for some of you, especially if you came to last lecture. I believe I used this map. I wanted to start with these three maps. There's one here, and then this one, because there was a couple of people who had a couple of misconceptions about what I meant when I was talking about these maps. So we're talking about the colonization of Africa. And every time we're talking about that, I want you to think immediately about slavery, because colonization and imperialism and all these things we're talking about is directly related to and directly because of slavery, all right? Because the slave trade sets into place a bunch of these structures, a lot of these empires that you see here, especially along the coast, were slave trading empires, all right? That's why a lot of these African groups, and a lot of you mentioned this in your reflections, fought each other. When you get the Europeans coming in to conquer Africa, you see a lot of these African groups joining the Europeans to conquer other Africans. That's because you have Africans from over here enslaving Africans from over here for hundreds of years and selling them to Europeans. So they're already kind of friends with the Europeans, and these guys already hate these guys. So the Europeans play that, play one group off of another and end up conquering most of Africa. So that's the kind of connections that we're trying to draw when we look at history. Not just, the Europeans had better technology, they had bigger armies, whatever. We're looking at, because of the fact that there's like 270 years of slavery and slave trade before this, we have a large effect on not only the population in Africa, because there's a lot less, but also the way that Africans treat one another, right? That's why you don't see the Africans, joining forces to fight off the Europeans. That's why you see a lot of, Africans turning on Africans during this time. So that's one thing I wanted to really clarify and really drill into your head. Um, the Africans did not just hate each other for no reason, right? There's a lot of history between these groups of people, and a lot of it, unfortunately, is having to do with slave trade, because that's how a lot of these African kingdoms got their money and got their start. So if we move down to the Berlin Conference, and just one more time, I'll kind of summarize that. All the European powers come together, all the major ones at least, um, and they literally take a pen and pencil and a map of Africa and they draw borders and say, all right, France, you're going to own this country. You'll call it like French New Guinea. And Britain, you're going to own this country. You'll call it, South Africa. And a lot of these territories, literally, they just kind of arbitrarily draw lines. They don't care who lives there. They don't care if there's 3 or 4 different tribes that hate each other in that one country. They don't care. All they care about is that, wow, there's a lot of rubber trees in the Congo. So we're just going to draw these lines real quick and boom, now that's the Congo and now it's mine because I want to grow rubber. And they do similar things all throughout Africa, right? I don't know the specifics of where all the natural resources are, but each of the colonies was pretty much chosen because they had a lot of natural resources that, insert European country's name here, wanted to exploit, all right? Whether that be Britain, France, Portugal, the Spanish, Germans, it didn't matter. Basically, all the European powers just wanted the African land because they knew that they had natural resources there. They didn't care about the people who lived there. They didn't care about any of that. They just wanted, the oil, the gold, the silver, the diamonds, the rubber, anything that could help them become more wealthy, right? And then this map. This map, some people were confused about because, to be fair, it is a little bit confusing. This is a map of Africa during World War I. Right? The blue areas are the Allied powers. That's not just one country that's a bunch of different European countries that are allied together. So you still have individual countries holding certain parts of land, right? France is right here, right? Britain is down here, Germany's here. The only reason that this is blue and this is like tan is because at the time, France, Britain, the United States, all of these countries that are marked in blue here, we're at war with Germany. All right. That's why there's only two colors here. But you got to remember, there's still, 8 or so countries that are holding land. Right. That was a little bit of a misconception that I saw. So it's still a bunch of different European powers. The Allied powers don't just become one country. They're just temporarily friends because they're at war with Germany, right? And we'll talk about how the whole World War One happened and why England and France and the United States are allies and Germany is against them. But we're not quite there yet. That's a really quick summary of what we've talked about already about European colonization of Africa. But really, and I'll say this one more time, what I want you to understand about the colonization of Africa is that it's really the legacy of the slave trade, right? The only reason, or one of the largest reasons, that Africa is so easily taken over is because of all of those negative effects that the slave trade has over the 200, 300 years that it's in place, right? You have entire groups of African people who get removed from the continent. You get, conflicts, obviously, between different African groups. And you have African groups that grow very rich off of the slave trade, and as such become good allies for the Europeans to kind of play off of as they take over Africa. Moving on to Asia, all right, if you did the imperialism maps activity, you'll notice that not only was there an African map, there was also an Asian map. We're not going to spend nearly as much time on Asia as it's not as large of a focus. I apologize if you can hear that. There's a truck outside. But like I was saying, that's about all we have to say about Africa. We've spent about 2-3 lectures on this. We'll only spend about the next 10 minutes on Asia. It's not because it's less important. It's just because it's less focused in the curriculum. And we really only need to touch on 2 small parts, okay? So first one is the United States and their interactions with Japan, all right? One of the biggest events between the West, so the United States, and the East, is when Commodore Perry, who was a naval officer of the United States, sails to Japan under the orders of the president to get them to open their borders, right? Japan, for a couple of hundreds of years, closed their borders entirely to foreign trade, with the exception of the Dutch, and I believe the Chinese, yeah, it's right there, yeah, the Dutch and the Chinese. The United States didn't like that very much because they didn't like the fact that if they wanted to buy something from Japan, they had to go through the Chinese or the Dutch. And the Chinese or the Dutch would charge them a lot of money because they were the only ones who had that stuff, right? So Commodore Perry, in a very American act, brings a bunch of really well-designed, really armored and armed ships to Japan, just kind of parks them off of the shore of Tokyo and delivers a letter to the Japanese leader telling him that he wants him to open the borders and that he's demanding that he be able to trade with Japan. So that happened, and then he went back to the United States and they gave Tokyo time to kind of consider. Then he comes back with more ships and more guns. And essentially, threatens the Japanese government at gunpoint, well, rather cannon point, um, to sign the treaty, allowing the United States to trade with them, and in fact, giving America somewhat of a monopoly on trade with Japan. Right, and this is really the start of Japanese American relations, and the start of what would inevitably become the American occupation of Japan after World War II. Um, the United States has always, in its interactions with Japan, at least after this point, used force to some extent to get what they wanted. Um, this is essentially the same thing as what the Europeans did to Africa, except you'll notice that the Europeans and the United States don't treat Asians the same way they treat Africans, right? They don't necessarily enslave Asians, although you do have a number of Chinese immigrants who work on the railroads out west who are treated fairly poorly. They're still not enslaved, all right? It's a different kind of relationship. And part of that has to do with racism. Part of that has to do with the society as a whole. I'm not going to get super into that. But essentially, Commodore Perry, and we've talked about him a little bit, rolls up to Tokyo with his goons, essentially, and threatens Japan until they tell him that it'd be okay if the United States traded with them, right? That's all you necessarily need to know about Commodore Perry. You don't even need to know the name of the president, all right? It was Millard Fillmore, a rather small president in the United States history. All you need to know, Commodore Perry forces Japan to open its borders, all right? Very similar things happen in China, except this time it's the British, all right? And the British at this time, some of my historian buddies and I like to joke that the British were the drug dealers of Asia, all right? The reason we say that is because one of the main things that the British actually sell to the Chinese people is opium, all right? Opium is a drug. It's a highly addictive drug. The reason that Britain decides that they're going to sell opium to the Chinese people is because that China doesn't really need anything else that the British have. All right, the tea that the English people and the British people want is grown in India and China. Right, silks, the Britain can't make those. Right, that's from China. All of these things that the British wants to buy are made in China. Right, and the British really don't have anything worthwhile to offer except for silver. All right. So part of the reason that all these European powers um, are, colonizing Africa, colonizing South America, because they want this silver and gold, is because they can only trade with China using silver, right? And then gold is used in their own countries. Britain has a great idea, though, right? Like I said, Britain decides, hey, they might not want anything that we have, but we do have opium. And if we sell the Chinese people a bunch of opium, they'll get addicted. And then if they're addicted, they have to keep buying it. So they'll have to trade with us. This is obviously wrong on many levels. And China doesn't like the fact that the British are trying to get the Chinese people addicted, right? So China fights back. China actually starts to destroy a lot of the opium that they seize, right? They'll go to the ports, they'll go to the markets, and they'll just take the opium from the people who bought it. They'll burn it, they'll destroy it. They don't want the people getting addicted. Britain decides that they don't like the fact that they're losing money because their product is getting destroyed, and they demand that China pay them for the drugs that they destroyed. obviously China's not going to pay the drug dealer for the drugs that they destroyed. So Britain decides to go to war with them. All right. Unfortunately for China, just like the United States, Britain has big ships with big guns that are far superior to the Chinese Navy. So you get a number of battles between the British and the Chinese. Ultimately, the Chinese lose. All right. And in return for their loss and not being completely taken over by the British, they have to sign a treaty that essentially says that the British can trade wherever they want, whatever they want, and also gives them access to Hong Kong. All right. Hong Kong was owned by Britain for a long time. Then we go to the Second Opium War. All right. Britain decides that since the government is currently dealing with a rebellion right here, it'd be a great time to attack them because they're already busy with something else. Once again, they're being a little bit of a scumbag, as a couple of students have noticed. Scumbag. They essentially fabricate, right? They just make up a reason to go to war with China. You can read this a little bit on your free time. I'm not going to necessarily get into it, but they essentially just make something up. And this happens a lot in history. A leader who wants something will kind of make up or plan an event so that it looks like we should go to war. The United States has actually done this with Mexico a number of times, but I don't teach U.S. history, so I'm not going to get sidetracked. So the British go to war with China. And then the French decide that that sounds like a good idea. So they also make a reason to go to war with China, join the British. And then essentially it's the same story as the First War. The British and the French have bigger guns, better technology, and they essentially just crush the Chinese. After this, the Chinese are forced to open even more land to the British and the French for trade. All right, they open even more ports so that the British and French can trade with them. It's just not very fair. It also includes the freedom of movement for Christian missionaries, excuse me, not mercenaries, which until now was essentially illegal, right? And this is the same for Japan. Both Japan and China viewed Christian missionaries as kind of a bad thing to have in your country because they're trying to convert people, they're trying to turn people away from your traditional culture towards a more European culture. And Christian missionaries were actually executed if they set foot on Japanese land. It wasn't so strict in China, but Europe didn't like this, right? Europe wanted their people to be able to go wherever they wanted and to be able to trade wherever they wanted. So they win the Second War as well. And then they actually, right here, you'll see, they actually give the British a little bit of more land next to Hong Kong that they wanted. Both of these wars, more or less, the United States, it's a little bit less of a war, but they do actually destroy some things, are essentially just so that the Europeans or the Americans or whoever is fighting them at this point can trade with them. Because the Asian market, so China and Japan, have a lot of natural resources. You'll notice it's kind of similar to Africa that Europe wants. But Europe doesn't want to pay full price, right? In fact, Europe doesn't want to pay if they don't have to. So they take over in more or less. In Africa, it's very literal. They take over most of the land and they start to hold it. In China, it's less so. They just kind of make China sign a bunch of treaties that say that they have preferential treatment and they don't have to pay the same taxes that everybody else has to, so they can make more money on trading. Um, Same thing with the United States, right? The United States wanted the right to trade exclusively with Japan. That's all we're really going to talk about in terms of the colonization of Asia. Just to know that eventually, this actually right here, Commodore Perry, this act actually eventually leads Japan to modernize. Because if there's anything that countries don't like or that leaders don't like, it's having to do things that they don't want to do because somebody has more guns than they do. So Japan essentially after this decides that we're not going to let that happen again. And they very quickly decide that they're going to modernize, right? Kind of like Ethiopia, like we talked about in Africa. They decide that they need to get guns, they need to get cannons, they need to make sure that someone can't just do this to them, right? Because it's humiliating. China, very similar, right? But Japan is really the big one that starts to industrialize and make guns and ammo and all this stuff. This actually leads Japan later, which is somewhat ironic, and we'll talk about this during World War II, to colonize parts of China and Korea, right? So Japan goes from being colonized to becoming the colonizer, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to World War II.